Hello, so today we're going to take a look at how to embed a sound within an Excel file. You'll remember previously we looked at playing sounds from Excel, but that was limited to sound files that the user already had on their computer or that was stored locally somewhere. So if we just drop into the developer tab here, you remember that we had this function declared at the top, this sound play sound 32 function, which allowed us to call a sound that was saved locally. So for example, we could reference a Windows media chime. So if we just hit the play here by calling this function, we'd get the chime, and we could also use one of our own sounds. And for the Wordle one, we used a win sound when the game was completed. Now, for that to work, obviously, when you save the file down and someone else opens the file, they also need to have access to that WAV file. And that would either need to be sent within a folder within the Excel file, or it would need to be stored somewhere else, like one of the standard Windows Media files already on their system. Now, unfortunately, embedding a sound within an Excel file isn't just as simple as kind of using insert up here and inserting it and then being able to reference it. It doesn't quite work like that. It turns out one of the best ways to do it is actually to store it in binary code form. Sounds very complicated, but it's actually reasonably straightforward, and that's what we're going to take a look at today. So if we just take a look at this Win tab, this is, believe it or not, that WAV file as individual bytes in binary code. So you can see we've got 32 columns here, and we've got a lot of rows, about 35,000 rows. This file itself is about just over a megabyte. So that's the whole file as binary stored on a sheet. Now, obviously we need a way in this Excel file to be able to create this. So let's take a look at how that's created and then how it's used within Excel to be able to play this. So let's go back to the developer tab, and you'll see we've got this embedding module here. Now, I've referenced at the top who originally came up with this. You can see it's quite old, 2012, a guy called Leith Ross, who was a heavy contributor on VBA and Excel forums. And I've tweaked it and updated it. But you can see from the summary what it does. It creates a copy of a file to the worksheet in binary format as bytes. So it's stored in however many rows and 32 columns. Technically any file could be stored this way and later restored, and then the restored file to use it is saved down to the user's temporary directory. So let's just have a look how this works. The first sub we've got here is choosing the sound file, and this is simply a wrapper to be able to bring up a open file dialog box, which will let you choose the sound file. It will then ask you for a name that the sheet is going to be called to store that binary data on, and then finally it will call this SaveToSheet function, passing those two variables, the file name and the sheet name that we want to use. So let's take a look at this SaveToSheet subroutine. I'm not going to go through this in full detail, but let's just have a look at what it does and how it works. So it sets the worksheet variable to the worksheet that you've given, and if that doesn't exist, it will create that worksheet. It will then clear contents from it, and in column AH on the top row, it will store the file name. So we can see back on our win file when this was created, AH row 1, we've got the win.wav. That's just the file name that's been saved down. It then creates a new file, and it uses this open file name for binary access read function within Excel VBA. And what this will do is it will open that file that we've got in binary format and read it as binary code. There's a little bit of error checking here to make sure the file isn't too large for Excel. But then pretty much from there it uses an array that will then loop through the binary code within that file and store it in this data array before finally outputting it to our worksheet. So really all it's doing is it's opening up a file, it's reading the binary code, and it's outputting it into Excel via looping through on this array. So that's part one of how you would include that. That's what you would do if you were creating a file to send to someone else. You would end up with a tab like this, or multiple tabs if you wanted to create multiple files, and you could hide this worksheet if you wanted so that the user would only see the front end of what they needed to see. The next part is obviously how do we use this file? How do we create the WAV file back from this binary code? And that's where this RestoreFile function comes in. So we give it the sheet name, and it essentially works in reverse to read those bytes and to put them back into a file with the name that we've saved in win.wav. So if we go back to the code and just have a look through this, again, some error checking just to make sure that the worksheet you've given it exists. It will create a new file, and it will do this in the temporary directory for the user. So this is just a temporary location that we can access on the user's computer. Again, it opens up that file for binary access, but this time we're writing instead of reading from it. And again, it loops through using an array, putting that final array data into this file before closing it. And it returns the file at the end. So essentially, we take all of this data here, all of these bytes, it wraps it all up, and it puts it in that temporary location on the user's hard drive. So all that's left now is to actually play this sound. So let's go back to the code, and we can use the same sound play sound 32 function as before, but this time, rather than using a location already on the user's drive, we can pass in this function with the sheet name, which will return a file which will be automatically generated and saved down in that instant onto the user's drive. So for this to work, we would just call embed play with an argument of the sheet name, which in this case is win, and hit return. And in that instance, that is taking all of this binary code, it's creating it into a WAV file called win.wav, and it is saving it down to that temporary directory on the user's computer before wrapping that in the sound play sound function, which enables it to be played. So let's just do one example of this in terms of how you would use it. If we scroll up to the top here, and we're going to run this ChooseSoundFile function. So if I run this, we get our dialog box up, and you can see I've got it navigated at the moment to word or sounds that I've got saved down. Let's use the lose version. It will then ask me for a sheet name for it to be saved on, so let's just call that lose. We'll hit OK. And it will now begin generating that binary code. Obviously, the larger the file, the longer it will take. This can take anywhere from 10-15 seconds for a very small file, up to a couple of minutes for a larger one that's around 1 to 2 meg. Okay, so now that's finished, let's take a look back at the file, and you'll see we've got this lose tab that's been created. Similar sort of length, even longer, 46,000 rows. And now, if we go back to our code, and instead of calling the win sheet, let's call the lose sheet. And there we go, we've got that lose file that's played from the binary code. So that's pretty much it. That's how you can embed an audio file within Excel with this method. There'll be a link to this spreadsheet in the video description. And if you've got any questions, please put them in the comments below and I'll do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. I'll see you next time.